Here is the most unsettling truth about life aboard a pirate ship in 1720. The ocean surrounding you in every direction, hundreds of miles of it, shimmering and vast, could not save you from dying of thirst. Men who spent their entire lives on the water often perished because of it. Not from cannon fire, not from rival crews, not from storms, from thirst. The greatest enemy a pirate ever faced was invisible, odorless, and already aboard the ship before it ever left port. It was the slow, creeping failure of the freshwater supply, and if you think that sounds dramatic, consider this. Historians believe more sailors died from dehydration and waterborne illness during the golden age of piracy than from any battle ever fought at sea. Let that sink in for a moment. Imagine standing on the deck of a wooden sloop somewhere in the Caribbean, somewhere around the year 1720. The sun overhead is merciless. The air smells of tar, salt, and something else. Something faintly rotten coming from below deck. Your mouth is dry. Your lips are cracked and bleeding at the corners. There is an entire ocean beneath your feet, and you cannot drink a single drop of it. Why? Because doing so would kill you faster than thirst itself. Seawater contains roughly 3.5% dissolved salt, a concentration far higher than what the human kidney can process. When you drink it, your body is forced to use more water to flush out the excess salt than the seawater itself provides. The result is a paradox of biological cruelty. The more you drink, the more dehydrated you become. Your cells begin to shrivel, your blood thickens. Muscle cramps set in, followed by confusion, then a kind of desperate, irrational madness that historical accounts describe with haunting consistency. Sailors who broke and drank seawater in moments of desperation were often dead within days, their bodies having essentially consumed themselves from the inside out, trying to compensate. Every pirate aboard a vessel in 1720 understood this on some level, even without the medical vocabulary to explain it. The sea was poison. Safe water had to come from somewhere else entirely. So where did it come from? The answer starts before the ship ever left port. Before any significant voyage, a pirate crew, or any maritime crew of the era for that matter, would fill enormous wooden casks, called hogsheads and tierces, with fresh water drawn from rivers, springs, or wells. A hogshead held roughly 63 gallons. A tierce held around 42. These barrels were loaded into the lowest part of the ship, the hold, where they sat in the dark, surrounded by ballast, bilge water, rats, and the constant groaning of wet timber. A crew of 80 men on a reasonably sized vessel might consume between 80 and 120 gallons of water per day, though rationing quickly reduced that number when supplies grew uncertain. The mathematics of survival were always working against them. A long voyage across the Atlantic or down toward the South American coast might take weeks, sometimes months. The barrels they loaded before departure had to last, and more often than not, they did not. Here is where it gets genuinely disturbing. Those wooden barrels, no matter how carefully sealed, were never truly sterile. Within days of loading fresh water into them, the wood itself began to leach tannins and resins into the supply. Within weeks, algae began to bloom along the inner walls, turning the water green, then gray, then a sickening brown. Bacteria multiplied in the darkness. Sediment settled at the bottom. Insect larvae, carried in from rivers and wells at the point of loading, hatched and swam freely through the supply. Historical accounts from the period, journals, court records, and naval reports describe sailors drinking water thick with floating matter, water that smelled of rot, water that tasted of wood and mold and something worse. One common description that appears repeatedly in maritime literature of the era refers to water that had to be held at arm's length before drinking because the smell alone was nearly unbearable. Crews attempted solutions. Charcoal was sometimes added to barrels in an effort to absorb impurities. Vinegar was occasionally used as a rudimentary disinfectant. Sailors learned to draw water from the bottom of the barrel rather than the top, where the algae and surface contamination were thickest. None of these methods were particularly effective, and none were universally practiced aboard pirate vessels, which operated outside the relatively more structured routines of naval ships. Pirate crews were democratic in many ways. There is genuine historical evidence that many pirate articles gave crew members a vote in major decisions, but that democracy rarely extended to a formal system of water management. What it meant in practice was that water discipline varied enormously from ship to ship, captain to captain, quartermaster to quartermaster. The quartermaster, in fact, played a critical role aboard pirate vessels that popular culture has almost entirely ignored. It was often the quartermaster, not the captain, who controlled the ship's provisions. Water rationing fell under his authority. Historical records from piracy trials of the period make clear that disputes over water and food were among the most common sources of conflict aboard ships. Wasting fresh water was a serious offense. Accounts suggest that men could be punished, sometimes severely, for spilling water, drinking outside of rationed hours, or tampering with the barrels. When you understand how precious that supply was, the punishment doesn't seem excessive. It was arithmetic. Every wasted gallon was a day's survival subtracted from the crew's collective account. But what happened when the barrels ran low? What happened in the middle of the ocean, weeks from any coast? Rain became a lifeline. Sailors in the Caribbean and Atlantic were acutely attentive to weather, not just for navigation and safety, but because a good rainstorm meant water. Crew members would rig sails, stretch canvas across the deck, and funnel rainwater into every available container. This was not a backup plan. It was a standard, practiced, anticipated part of maritime life. The problem was consistency. Storms in the tropics could be violent and unpredictable, and the same weather system that brought precious rainwater could also wreck a ship. There is something almost poetic and deeply grim about the image of a crew catching rain in the middle of a hurricane, desperately filling buckets while the mast cracks overhead. Far more reliable than rain was the strategic use of islands and coastlines. Watering stops, deliberate landfalls made specifically to resupply fresh water, were among the most carefully planned aspects of any long voyage. Pirates were intimately familiar with islands in the Caribbean, the Bahamas, the coast of West Africa, and the waters off Madagascar that offered accessible freshwater springs and rivers. This knowledge was genuinely valuable, sometimes kept deliberately obscure. An island with a reliable freshwater source was worth more to a pirate captain than a map to sunken gold, because without water, no crew could sail anywhere at all. But watering stops came with their own terrifying dangers. Landing parties sent ashore for water frequently encountered hostile indigenous populations, rival pirates, naval patrols, and the very real threat of tropical disease. Malaria, yellow fever, and dysentery waited on many of the same islands where freshwater flowed. The men most exposed to these risks were the ones sent ashore with the barrels, often the lower-ranking crew members with the least say in the decision. If you stop and think about it for a moment, the entire system was balanced on an edge. You needed water to survive the voyage, but getting water sometimes meant risking your life in a completely different way. Alcohol enters this story in a way that defies the popular romantic image entirely. Yes, pirates drank rum. Yes, beer, ale, and wine were carried aboard ships. But the reason alcohol played such a large role in maritime provisions was not primarily cultural, it was practical. Alcoholic beverages, particularly beer and ale, were far more resistant to the bacterial contamination that ruined water so quickly. The fermentation process created an environment hostile to many of the microorganisms that turned water foul. A small barrel of ale could remain drinkable long after a cask of water had become a biological disaster. Rum, acquired through raids on merchant vessels or purchased in Caribbean ports, was consumed in diluted form, the famous naval grog, water mixed with rum, in part because the alcohol helped mask the taste of questionable water and may have provided some degree of antimicrobial benefit. But here is what the romantic image always leaves out. Rum was never a substitute for water. A human body cannot survive on alcohol. Alcohol is itself a diuretic, meaning it encourages the body to expel water. Regular consumption without adequate freshwater intake accelerated dehydration. This was understood, at least empirically, by experienced sailors of the period, even if the chemistry behind it was not. Rum was a supplement, a morale booster, a social ritual, not a survival solution. What about desalination? This is where historical honesty requires a clear distinction between what theoretically existed and what practically happened aboard pirate vessels. The basic chemistry of distillation, heating seawater until it evaporates and then collecting the condensed freshwater, was understood in principle by the early 1700s. Alchemists and natural philosophers had experimented with similar processes for centuries. There is some evidence that larger, well-provisioned naval vessels occasionally carried rudimentary distillation apparatus. However, the practical limitations were severe. Producing meaningful quantities of distilled fresh water required sustained heat, fuel that wooden sailing ships carried in limited quantities. The equipment was heavy, took up valuable space, and produced relatively small volumes of water for enormous amounts of effort. There is no compelling historical evidence that pirate ships of 1720 routinely carried or relied on distillation equipment as a meaningful part of their water supply strategy. The real solutions were always the more unglamorous ones: planning ahead, rationing ruthlessly, collecting rain, and making landfall before the barrels ran dry. When those strategies failed, and sometimes they did, the suffering was profound. Historical accounts from the period describe crews in the final stages of dehydration in harrowing terms. The tongue swells. The skin loses its elasticity. Vision blurs. Men who had spent their lives performing demanding physical labor under the Caribbean sun were reduced to near immobility by the simple absence of drinkable water. The craving itself becomes something almost hallucinatory at extreme stages, which may explain accounts of desperate sailors drinking seawater, urine, and even the blood of fish, methods that offered no real salvation and hastened death rather than delayed it. If this has surprised you, if the image of pirates you carried into this video looks different now than it did at the beginning, drop that reaction in the comments below. The reality of life at sea in 1720 had almost nothing to do with treasure maps and swashbuckling adventure. It was grinding, physical, daily survival work, dominated by the most basic human need. The greatest threat aboard those creaking, salt-soaked vessels was not the British Navy. It was not rival pirates or hidden reefs. It was the slow emptying of a slimy wooden barrel below deck, and the days of desperate open ocean sailing that followed. Survival at sea in 1720 was a logistical problem solved by knowledge, discipline, and no small amount of luck, and those who solved it badly simply did not come back. If you want more historically accurate stories that cut through the myths and tell you what life actually looked like in the past, subscribe. There is far more waiting for you.